Hi, you've tuned in to Radio Northern Beaches, your Listen Local station, right here on the Northern Beaches of Sydney. You can find us on your radio dial at 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Can't get to a radio? No worries. You can always stream our program live from anywhere in the world at rnb.org.au. And for listening on your own schedule, our podcasts are available globally at rnbpodcast.com.au. So be sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Now, here is our latest podcast.
Hello again, listeners to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM. We stream live on our website, www.rnb.org.au. I'm Michael Lester, our program's Community Voices. We're absolutely delighted today to having join us here on Radio Northern Beaches, a most highly respected, much awarded and celebrated Australian writer, Alex Miller. Alex, over the past 30 years or so, has written some 14 or 15 novels. He's been, as I say, much awarded, internationally published in translations with his books. He's particularly been recognised twice with the Miles Franklin Award for his books. The book we're going to be discussing today is his latest. It could be his 15th or 16th. I've lost count. It's called The Deal. Thanks for taking the time to join us, Alex.
Pleasure, Michael. Thanks for asking me.
Alex, you've been incredibly prolific in the last 30 or 40 years, but I believe that you came to writing fairly late in life, having started around the late 1990s. What brought you into the world of writing at that point, turning out a couple of major novels every year?
Yes, that's sort of basically true. I was really a country worker in England and then in Australia. I came here when I was 16 on my own with the dream of becoming an Australian cowboy, as I thought of it. And I did. I worked as a stockman in the Central Highlands of Queensland and then in the Gulf country, in Alexis Wright's country as a ringer. Yeah, and I just sort of had enough of it after a few years and went down to Melbourne, went to the university, conceived the idea of being a writer. I was a reader. I read a lot. And I thought, well, that's something I'll never get sick of if I become a writer. And I was thinking in terms of someone like Graham Greene or, I didn't know a huge amount. I had read Sebald, and he remained an influence for me. But I went to Melbourne Uni to read English and history in order to become educated as to what was available in the culture that I was part of. It was a slow, difficult beginning. I didn't meet anybody in the literary world, and in a sense, I probably avoided it a bit because it was the time when the Pram Factory was kind of centre stage as a sort of great renaissance of Australian homegrown writing, I guess. I kept out of the way of that because I knew I could never be part of it. I mean, it was when I met Steph, which is now 50 years ago, 1975, I published my first fiction in Meanjin. Jim Davidson's first issue of Meanjin was called Comrade Pavel, and it was a story about a chap who was my best friend and my mentor. He was my father's age, a Jewish person who'd been a anti-Nazi operative during the war and had somehow managed to escape to Australia. And I loved him, and he was enormously helpful to me, and he believed in me. So he sort of gave me a kind of okay to go ahead and become a writer. I didn't have a lot of confidence in my ability. I had a kind of burning determination, but I didn't have a lot of confidence, I suppose. And then I began to write novels.
And very successfully, it seems, almost from the word go. I think you had your first Miles Franklin with Ancestor Game, which must have been, one of your first excursions?
Number 3. The first one was set in England on the farm where I'd worked. And it was about the people I loved there, and I loved the farm, I loved the people. But I couldn't get that published in Australia. It was acknowledged by publishers as being a very good book, lovely story, etc., but it's not Australian, is it? So I finally found a publisher for myself in England, Robert Hale. They just published a history of Exmoor where the story's set.
You subsequently got the Miles in 2003, nearly 10 years after that, with Stone Country. The Stone Country was very firmly set up in Queensland there, so place is important. But the theme, perhaps, or a theme in your work, and particularly I'd imagine in this book, The Deal, your latest book, art is striving for something beyond our reach, so we always fail. and are longing for something that can never be ours. Now, you open the book, The Deal, with a very touching prologue or first section called The Boy, a 6-year-old boy with his father. His father gives him what you call at the end of the book the quiet gift of art. It was always there to drive you. Has this pursuit of a form of art through writing, is that something that's motivated you in your whole writing career?
I think of art as in the traditional sense of the artist, the painter. I don't really think of writing fiction as an art. I think of it as a craft, as something that we love to do. And I'm a storyteller before anything else. I care most about the story. But I call it fiction because they pay you a lot more. If you call it memoir or something, I don't pay you very much, and you don't sell a lot of them. I have written memoir. I wrote a memoir of Max, which was shortlisted for the National Book Award, but National Biography Award. But I generally, a book like The Deal is just true. It's basically a memoir. I remember Helen Garner, our wonderful, wonderful writer, Helen, when she wrote The Spare Room. Someone said, that's not a fiction. That really happened. And I said, if she calls it a fiction, if she calls it a novel, it is a bloody novel. And that's about it. I think a lot of novels, if not all of them, well, no, not all of them. The genre novels, I suppose, are like crime fiction or fantasy and those things. They're not something that happened to the writer. But I think serious novels, as they're called for some reason or other, are fictions that are drawn from the life of the writer. Like even Graham Greene, who called his books an entertainment. They were drawn from his own life, those books. You couldn't write like Graham Greene. You had to write like who you were. But not if you were a genre writer, you could write like other people, I suppose. I don't know. I've never tried it, to be honest. But and I admire it greatly, but I don't do it. I can only do stuff that I've virtually lived or been part of, or say a book like Conditions of Faith. It's my story told through a young woman's life. Because in a way, beginning as a writer with no connections to literature, no connections in the family or among friends of literature, beginning in that way, supported by wonderful friends like Max Blatt and my wife, Stephanie, who I met 50 years ago. And, having that kind of support is critical, but it doesn't solve the problem of how to do it. And it's what keeps you going, in a sense. You don't do these things on your own. Hardly know what I'm saying, really.
I was going to pick up on that, if I may, that this book is subtitled, at least in the contents page, A True Story in 4 parts, The Boy, the Man, the Deal, and the Time of Ghost. So in a sense, it's almost a chronological development. But at the heart of this is a deal. And like so much of your fiction, not only is it wonderful storytelling, but as you say, this is a serious novel. That's the term you've used. And you always confront, as you do in this novel, some deep question of moral choice, which is what you set up here, isn't it? Where we have as it were, the main character, Andy, who's an unpublished aspiring writer who develops a relationship with a very frustrated fellow part-time teacher, an artist, Lang. Now, there's a lot of truth in this story, isn't it? Because you tell part of the story in your earlier Miles Franklin book, don't you? The Ancestor Game, where this central character in this, Lang Tzu, features. So this is a revisiting, is it, of that character and the tensions that character faces?
Yes, it's a revisiting of Lang himself. The truth is that he shot himself, finished it. He was suffering awfully. He was an alcoholic, failed artist. What more do you want? And he was unmarried, unconnected in that sense, alone. So he shot himself. He'd had enough. And it wasn't a bad decision, really. It was dreadful for me because I loved the guy and was in many ways dependent on him, as we are on really good friends. We need them. And I met him when we were teaching together, and I thought he was a wonderful person. He was Chinese Australian, and the tragedy with so many Chinese Australians is that there can never be blokes. There can never be Aussie blokes. They're always Chinese Australians. They're never just Australians. I don't know why this is. It's racism, I suppose, whatever we want to call it. But his ancestors came here, and I couldn't bear to write about him failing so totally that he shot himself. And so when I wrote The Ancestor Game, it became about these other things. It became about the 3 people who were at the center of the book, Lang Tzu, Dr. Spies, and Gertrude Spies, his daughter. and how each of them lived in a form of exile, which is what we do in Australia. In a sense, we're in exile from Europe unless we're Indigenous people. And we're not. In fact, most of the world doesn't live in an Indigenous condition. It lives in the condition of having travelled from one place to another. Most Americans, their ancestors didn't come from America. They came from somewhere else. The same with England, even in Europe, if you look at it at all closely. And definitely Australia. I mean, we're a wonderful success as a migrant culture, which is what we're going on building now, and it changes with each generation. So these three people were part of that. They were strangers to the country and yet at home here, because it's not only possible but essential that migrants find home in exile. That's what the book, in a sense, was about. It was complex and big. The deal, I couldn't bear to also remain tight-lipped or silent about what really happened with myself and Lang Zhu. And so I told the real story, the true story, in this book, The Deal. At the center of the story, there is a deal. The deal isn't actually criminal, but it's not good. It's not a kosher thing. It's not a good bit of behavior. It's sort of doing something that happens in the art world all the time, which is you make money out of other people's ignorance. We're not talking about a fake. We're talking about something that isn't signed, that's had some sort of difficult background, that's become unsaleable in the big auction houses for some reason. All those sorts of things affect the price. And we were somehow circumventing all that and I was doing it for him so he could buy this sicket, which he adored, sicket, and there was a sicket available. And so I went along with it. And because I was unknown in the Melbourne art world, I was able to pull this deal off. And I did it for him. It was much more scary than it is in the book.
Your character, Andy, sounds very much like the character you're describing as yourself in
It is myself.
Yeah, the deal, that's right.
Story.
But of course, he faces a real testing, doesn't he, of his own integrity, the morality of what he becomes involved in this fraud, if you like, or unethical practice in pursuit of money, let's face it. What's the moral dilemma that this character's facing in going along with this? Is it a test of friendship? What's it doing to his integrity as an artist?
Yeah, good question. Good question. And I don't think the book answers that sort of question. I think it asks it. Your reading of the book has obviously come up with that question. What is this situation demanding of the main character in a moral sense? It's a dilemma for him because friendship on the one hand is at stake. Love of his wife and child are at stake on the other side of the coin here because he's taking up a lot of his time, the failed artist. And is this a kosher thing to do? Is it a decent thing to do? Is it the right thing to do, even if the people he's doing it to are not themselves all that straight? So it is a moral question. I don't have an answer for it, and I doubt if anybody does. What, in a sense, I mean, there's a difference between philosophy and fiction in the sense that philosophy makes large statements about behavior and morals, and very rarely offers you examples of how these things operate in reality. Like, if you talk about morality, it tends to be in philosophy, it tends to be in grand and very wonderful, deep thinking type of ways. But if you talk about morality in fiction, you talk about what people do. And it's up to the reader of that to decide themselves whether what the person has done is decent, moral, clever, funny, whatever. I mean, it's left up to the reader to read actively the story.
Our guest here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches, Alex Miller. We're discussing Alex's 15th novel, or 16th, I've lost count, called The Deal. Alex, in this story, the character Andy, he does a lot to support this friendship of this very distressed and frustrated and failed character, Lang, the artist. But in a sense, you might say that he perhaps is being manipulated by his friend, and is it a real friendship? But on the other hand, he does draw something from this, doesn't he, by the telling? He manages to write a notebook based around this, on which he then writes a book. So it's sort of a deal that's contributing and giving him access to this story that he then publishes as a book, isn't it? And there's also money involved in this because he's pressed for money, etc., and he can get money through this deal.
You've done a very good reading of the book. I mean, that's the book I hoped that I'd written. And it's a true story, as I've said. It could be called a memoir. It would be just the same. I wouldn't change anything if I called it memoir. The only thing that would change would be the amount of money I got for it and the number of people who would read it. Not so many people go to the memoir shelves as go to the fiction shelves to enjoy escapism of the novel. I mean, that's the truth. And to me, it's always a journey of this interior life, and that's what there's what the people do has a moral quality. All action has a moral quality. It's impossible to escape from moral questions in our lives. We are moral beings, even if we're immoral or amoral. We're still affected by the morality of the occasion, whether there are other people involved or not, in relation to our environment, to animals, to our relationships with the world and our lives are kind of moral things that are very, very basic. It's a very basic thing about us. We have conceived this ourselves. Plato was somebody who I read at the university and I loved because the clarity of his work is such that you can read it. You can imagine what he's talking about. Whereas with, say, Schopenhauer or someone like that, you can't. It's very abstract. And very rarely are you ever given an example which you can actually latch onto. But anyway, why am I talking about this? I don't know.
That's okay. It's very much the issue that I've raised for you to answer. But another theme here, though, is the statements along the lines of a novel is always a dream. It's an imaginative storytelling. But this seems to be connected to the question of the artist's, or in this case, writer's freedom to explore and to do this sort of work. And this is connected a bit, I think, on my reading, to the artist or the writer as an outsider to the society. So is this an ingredient in the freedom to be able to write, to be, in a sense, in a society and at home in a society, but not a real part of the society?
There's an element of that. I mean, none of these things are black and white, are they? It's not clearly the case that a writer or an artist is an outsider to society. In many ways, you're not. In many ways, you're embraced. If you're successful at all, if you develop, as I've been fortunate enough to do, a substantial readership, then I suppose you're in it, you're part of it. But there has to be a sense in you that you can stand back from this and examine it. It used to be called introspection. And I probably, when I started writing, one of the reasons I managed to take so long to get anything done was that I was almost 100% introspective, leading more towards philosophy than fiction. And then I was writing about the Tibbington Knot, which was my first story that I'd actually written, novel, and novella, in fact. And I mentioned it to Chris Hemmensley, an Australian English poet, and he sent out my letter around the world to his letter writing friends, and quite a few came back with, "We'd like to hear more about this Tibbington Knot." So it kind of was a breakthrough for me. I realised I shouldn't be. I remember saying to Chris, "So I can write about that, can I?" He said, "That is what you can write about." And it kind of was a breakthrough for me to understand that I wasn't supposed to be writing purely about the morality of human nature, and I was supposed to be writing stories. And it was wonderful. It was a new freedom for me. So I wrote the Tibbington Knot from Australia, researched it from Australia. And when it was published, it was reviewed by what they call an ex-more notable, a hunting notable in England, as being, "This man knows his hunting country. He's one of us, and he's changed his name. Who is it?" But it was me. I was writing it in Port Melbourne, and I wasn't one of them. That was one reason why it took me so long. I misunderstood, even though I'd read a lot of fiction and literature over the years. I was a very wide reader. Even though I'd read a lot, I hadn't understood the basis of it, which was story. And I'd thought that the basis of it was somehow morality. Morality, of course, still gets into it, but it can't be the basis of it. That's the basis of philosophy. It's not the basis of fiction. Fiction is action. It's movement. It's what people do. To a degree, it's also what they say, but it's more how they behave and what they actually do. What they say is one thing, what we say is one thing, and what we do is something else. Always. There's always a modification. There's always slippage between our statements about ourselves and others in what we understand and what we actually do. On the day, we are different people for different friends. And it's impossible not to be, because that's what we are. We're like that.
To return to a point I think you were making earlier, I think you've written somewhere in the book that the book is not so much the story of Lang and what happened to him, but as a celebration of the loss of our ancestral homelands. For example, and in particular, of course, you portray Lang, I think you used the phrase, who lived a life of erasure, erasing his Chinese past and aspiring to become an Australian, which he could never succeed. How is this a theme in your writing more generally and in your approach, this idea of the loss of our ancestral homelands. For example, you're constantly here setting this book up as you did from boyhood and your father's influence with art and painting. Is this another sense of a loss of ancestral homeland in the past?
I suppose so. One thing I envied when I was a child, when I was really young, was the dance and song that African people possessed. African people used to come, entertainers used to come to London when I was a kid, and they'd perform their dances and their songs were handed down to them as traditional forms, and we didn't have any. I wasn't aware of the fact that the culture to which I belonged had any of these things. Whatever they might have had, I was separated by many generations from those things, and I envied the people who still had contact. I suppose people, Japanese and Chinese, and certainly Jewish people, still have contact with the early chants, the ancient chants and songs. Whether they understand them in the same way or not it's a question. But they have those things, and there is an in-touchness about them to their deeper pasts. My past doesn't go back beyond my mum and dad. I never met any of my grandparents, and I was sort of in the majority where I was. Most of us weren't in touch with anything much in the past. Mum was Irish, or her ancestors were, and my dad was from Glasgow. They were sort of immigrants within England, and I was their son. And I came to Australia as part of the tradition, I suppose, of the family, was the tradition of migrating from one place and one culture to another. Australia, of course, for me, not for Indigenous people, but for me, was an incredibly welcoming culture. It was a culture that had been formed by the Irish and the British and the Scots, and I felt very much part of it when I arrived. It was nothing was foreign or strange about it, and I was made welcome. I met wonderful people. I felt it was the beginning of real life and a liberation from the awfulness of the class intensity in England, where everyone had to explain themselves as to who are you, where do you come from, and are you supposed to be normal, sort of thing. Questions that were never asked of me in Australia. There was a freedom from all that. So being free from your past is also being free from the requirements and dictates of tradition and the beliefs, the old beliefs, and the forms and traditions of people who. It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? If you are a member of a group who is still deeply in touch with their own traditions, there are certain compromises you'd have to make, I'm sure, to meet these. I mean, I remember when we first went to Poland in search of my friend Max Blatt's relations, who we eventually found in Israel. But in Poland, we met these wonderful people who were leading a kind of resurrection of the Jewish culture, of the Eastern European Jewish culture in Poland itself, in Wrocław, which used to be Breslau when it was in Germany. And these people were Jewish, but they weren't kind of stuck. They were a kind of they sort of reformed themselves into, let's not lose Judaism totally. We can reclaim some of it. We've still got some of it. That's what they're working at. They're doing that at a place called the White Stork Synagogue in Wrocław, and they're still doing it. So those people had to, Oleg, the chap who was then the chairman of the Jewish group in Wrocław, he said, we don't belong here, but this is our home, which was a pretty interesting statement.
Yes.
They'd all been exiled. They'd all been grown up in Norway or Russia or somewhere else, but they'd come home in the sense to a place where their ancestors had originally come from, and they'd been kicked out of there and moved around and survived somehow. So there was a huge complex of possibilities available to them of who they could decide to be. And when they came to Australia to stay with us after we'd visited them, they took advantage of that. I mean, I remember him saying, I live in Castlemaine, which is a small town or a half-size sort of town in Victoria, wonderful town. And we went down to the Theatre Royal in the middle of town one evening to have dinner and a few drinks, and it happened to be on a night when there was a band at the Theatre Royal. So there were just hundreds of people milling around out in the street, drinking, laughing, talking, music going on. And he said, now I have to go in search of my Castlemaine. In other words, a place where you can be as free as you guys are here. That was wonderful.
Yes.
That sort of cultural freedom is always a double-edged sort of sword. You belong, but you don't belong entirely to yourself and your self-will.
Yeah.
And if you're forced into exile, obviously that's another thing.
Yeah.
It's a punishment or something.
On Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches with our guest Alex Miller. We're discussing his latest of 15 or 16 books, The Deal. Alex, there's a theme throughout your book and maybe throughout your work, I don't know, of the passing of time and age and how that affects your work as a writer or an artist. I think you've described writing, have you, as a dangerous occupation, but you've said too, I think, that the older you get, the more dangerous it gets. This is work of your mature years. How is that reflected, for example, in the way you've had to approach this book, this element of danger, or is it wisdom as you get older? Is it a matter of what drives you as a writer? Is it ambition? Is it seeking after the truth? Is it money? Is it imagination? What is it?
Yeah. Good question. Look, I don't remember saying that it was dangerous or anything like that, but I probably did. I'm not saying you're just making it up, but yeah, I'm not sure what I would have meant dangerous. I guess, I mean, I've been trying to give it up a bit, but I can't. It's like trying to give up smoking or something else. If I don't come in here and sit down at the study and start work on a story of some kind, I really am at a great loss. And I mean, I think I started writing to give some sense of purpose to my life, something that was a bit more meaningful to me than just managing to get by from day to day. And I didn't have a profession. I didn't have the kind of education that would have given me a profession other than teaching, falling back on, as they say. He fell back on teaching, which anybody is allowed to do almost. And unfortunately, not taken that seriously. Being taken more seriously than it used to be, I hope. But yeah, so I didn't have a profession to fall back on. I didn't have maths and science. I had humanities. That was all I had, really. History, which I loved and still love, and history always gets into my books. And I guess the observations of life, beginning to write, I only ever, I mean, I remember Max told me once to write, why don't you write about something you love? Because I'd written some rubbish or other, which he'd read, and he didn't like it at all, and I didn't either. And of course, it never got published. I don't suppose I even tried to publish it. But he said, why don't you write about something you love? And that was another breakthrough. That was exactly, oh, what a relief. How wonderful. Is that what I can do? That's what you must do. Oh, wonderful. It was an insight. We don't do these things alone. I don't think we'd do anything worthwhile alone. In fact, I probably wouldn't have written anything at all if it hadn't been for Steph, my wife, who was my great companion and encourager throughout these last 50 years. And I think, well, it's 50 years since I first published a story that Max gave me. And that was published in Meandrin in 1975. But it's 50 years ago, isn't it? It's flicked by, all that.
I could be at danger of misquoting you again as we close with only a minute or so to go.
Go for it.
I've got some notes here that suggest that, that years of struggles to turn into a writer expressing youthful hopes and dreams. But then a quote that I seem to have noted, a detachment from youth that is one of the advantages of old age. I don't know if you did say that. I thought you might have.
I did.
That or not?
Yeah, I said that because it was something I realized that there were stories I could tell now that I couldn't tell when I was young. And one of them, not obviously, but I mean, obvious to me, I guess, is the story of the truth of what happened with Lang Tzu.
Yes,
I couldn't write that when I was young. I just didn't have the detachment from it. I was too involved. I loved the guy, and I still love him, but I love him now in that kind of distant return way that your dead friends have, where they're vitally alive to you in many ways, but also dead, finished. Like I think Chinese say, it is finished. She is finished. Or maybe it's somebody else says that. I don't know. Somebody told me recently that rather than saying he or she is dead, they say he is finished, which is lovely. Finished the story, finished their turn. You've had your turn, you're finished. It's nice.
Well, time's up for us too, Alex, I'm afraid, and I guess we're finished too. But
it's finished.
A theme in your book too, where you reflect at some point about old age, and in fact some of the remarks that you attribute to the boy's father in this book about getting old. But in any event, it's been absolutely fascinating, not only reading your latest book, The Deal, Alex, but hearing you speak about it and how you approach and shape these wonderful works of storytelling, but also of great seriousness and moral complexity. Thank you so much for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches, Alex.
It's been a pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. we've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3, now hitting the entire world on www.rmb.org.au.